Good morning. I want to, first of all, Mazel Tov to Rabbi Avram Hoshander, birth of a granddaughter, son. Mazel Tov. Mazel Tov. Apropos, I want to start a new little mini series here, a few days, on the sugya of Chinuch. A lot of different aspects to the mitzvah that many of us have, maybe everybody has, on educating or chinuch of the young children, and it's unclear. There isn't much of a siman in Shulchan Aruch about chinuch. It's all over the place, and has to do with really four things. What everybody knows probably about chinuch. The mitzvos. You have to teach a kid to do mitzvos. You get them tefillin, you put tefillin on, learn about it. But before that, there's a mitzvah of chinuch, d'Rabbanan, possibly d'Oraisa, or as a question. The mitzvah of chinuch when a child is born or when he's 1 or 2 years old, and that is chinuch to be a mensch. That's probably like the main chinuch. The main chinuch is from a very young child to be able to train a child, a boy or a girl, to lead their life in a correct way. You can see that this has to be, has a lot of expertise, and I'm not talking here about parenting, but I guess that's part of it. Being a teacher at school is part of it, but you can see, as I just happened to see the Shalah Kadosh points out, that you can see even a tiny little child has different Middos, and one has to carefully, train. You could, as an example, you could spoil a child. Even a little baby, you could spoil a child. So that's going to affect the child when they grow up. So anything that is going to affect somebody when they grow up, that goes into the category of chinuch. There's an idea of chinuch of learning, teaching a child how to learn Torah, or learning Torah. Aviv chayav lalamdai Torah. You have to learn probably the whole Torah with your child before their bar mitzvah, so they know what to do. But if you look at the Rambam, that's what he says, chayav lalamdai Torah, and it includes just about everything of that. So that's the importance of chinuch from a point of view of education, not Middos training, but education. And then there's a Indian of chinuch. These are all, I'm mentioning these not just because I made a list, but because these are all sugyas in Shas. There's a mitzvah of chinuch, or a din of chinuch, which has to do with lois hasei, keeping a child away from lois hasei, when yes, when not. For instance, the Gemara says that that if you see a little kid, we have to discuss how little. If you see a little kid eating treif, you're not mechuyev to take him away. Yet you're not allowed to give him the treif. So training on a lav is a kind of a sugya b'fnei atzmai, and then there's mitzvahs essay. So somehow or another, that's called chinuch more than the others, even though it's probably the least of it. And that's teaching kids when they come of age how to do mitzvahs. So you have really different things. You have behavior, you have education, you have los hasei, and you have essay. All of these become the chiyuv of a father and mother, kol zman that the child has not reached the maturity to be able to take responsibility for their own behavior, their own nasiyas hamitzvos, which Chazal were mashayir of bar mitzvah. Somehow or another, kimlam lechazal, that when a child becomes, when a child is maybe shtei saros, when he reaches a level of physical maturity, and you can that also has to be discussed. There's a chazaka de Rabbah. Rabbah said there's a chazaka that the chazaka says, okay, when he's 13 years old, when a girl is 12 years old, girl also has to have shtei saros. When a girl is 12 years old, they've reached a level of physical maturity. It seems very young to us, no? Like 12 years old, 13 years old, is there a level of maturity? And it's not so much that you're putter from chinuch at that point, but now they become responsible for themselves. The nekuda is that now they become, in other words, Hashem doesn't make people responsible for themselves if they're not able to be responsible themselves. So that's the way the whole thing works. That until a child becomes responsible for themselves, we have to train them and teach them how to be responsible and how to take that responsibility seriously. And these are all, each one of them has halachas, when to do mitzvos, when you have to insist. Avelus has different mitzvahs, like 9 days. Tisha B'Av has to be cut in Yodei Savel. It's a different level of das. But it's really, it's midrabanan, but I'm saying it's really zeres hakosov, if you will, that all of a sudden at bar mitzvah, woohoo, I'm chayiv in mitzvah, so before that I'm patur in mitzvahs. It's not something we would say naturally. And just one last thing is my hakdam, and then we'll get into the details of it tomorrow, is that every mitzvah is different. When it comes to chinuch and mitzvahs, every mitzvah is different. The difference of the mitzvah of chinuch for tzitzis is different than the mitzvah of chinuch for tefillin. Each one has its own gedarim, which is different than the mitzvah of kosher and treif. All of these things have different gedarim and different halachas. It's not like a magical thing of 2 months before your bar mitzvah, or when you're 12, or when you're 11. So people often ask, like, what's the age of chinuch? Well, it depends chinuch for what. Every chinuch, and even for Middos, Rabbi Yaacov famously said, before the child is born. That's when the chinuch of a child begins. That's for Middos. That's for good. It's showing an example. So everything has its gedarim, and some things, one last thing, go on even after bar mitzvah and bas mitzvah. It's a mistake to think that all matters of chinuch end once the child has das, because obviously they're not responsible for themselves completely. So Rav Moshe Feinstein says, as an example, that even after a child's bar mitzvah, you still have to educate them. At first he says, well, that's the minhag, you pay for your kid's high school tuition. But he says, no, that's something the child can't do for themselves. How they're supposed to educate themselves, how they're supposed to go to yeshiva gdola, and who's going to pay for it, and who's going to choose it for them. So they have das, but they don't have the das to be able to do this themselves. So Rav Moshe writes in the Igros Moshe, that keeps on going for a while. So every part of chinuch has its piece, and Be'ez Hashem, a few days will be mevared.